I never planned on becoming a criminal. I wasn't raised that way. My father was a quiet carpenter, my mother a librarian. Both believed that justice belonged to the system, that revenge was a poison. But that belief died the day my wife Claire did. And with her death, something inside me was reborn, something far more dangerous than grief. It all started with a phone call. A detective's voice, flat and apologetic. They'd found her car abandoned near an old bridge, the driver's side door swinging open, her bag still inside. When they found her body 2 days later, what was left of my world just crumbled into silence. There was no dramatic outburst, no screaming at the sky, just an emptiness so deep it rang in my ears like static. They caught him 2 months later. The Willow Creek Butcher, the media called him. A man named Grant Harlow, a mechanic in his mid-30s, with the kind of face you forget the second you look away. He had that bland, blue-collar normalcy that often hides the rot just beneath the surface. 5 confirmed murders. Claire was the last. The trial was short. The evidence felt overwhelming. Her necklace found in his garage, fibers from his truck, her blood. The jury didn't even look at him when they read the verdict. Death sentence. But in our state, that just meant years of appeals, legal delays, and psychological evaluations. For me, it meant nothing but waiting. I thought his capture would bring peace, but it didn't. Nights stretched on endlessly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire's face in those final moments, as if she were still calling out to me from that dark, lonely roadside. Then one evening, while sorting through her things, I found her old journal. I hadn't touched it since the funeral. Inside, there was an entry, dated just days before she disappeared, that froze me completely. If anything happens to me, she wrote, it won't be random. Someone's been following me. I think I know who. And right there was a name scribbled in the margin. But it wasn't Grant Harlow. It was someone else. Detective Owen Calder. That name split my reality in two. Calder was the man in charge of her case, the one who delivered the news of her death. The man who shook my hand and told me with false sincerity that they'd found her killer. For weeks I couldn't eat, couldn't think. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I started visiting the courthouse, sitting in the back during appeals, just watching Harlow behind the thick glass. He was calm, too calm, and Calder. He always avoided my eyes. The idea came slowly, like poison dripping into my bloodstream. What if the wrong man was in prison? What if Claire's real killer was walking free, hiding behind a badge? Obsession has a way of justifying itself. It starts as a question and ends as a mission. I began collecting everything I could: police reports, newspaper clippings, court transcripts. I spent late nights at the public library, scanning microfilm under a dim yellow light. I mapped out every detail of the case, every timeline inconsistency, every missing report number. And the deeper I dug, the more the cracks began to show. The evidence that convicted Harlow, it was all conveniently discovered by Calder himself. The necklace, the star witness, the anonymous tip. It was all too neat. One night I drove to the edge of Willow Creek, to the mechanic shop where Harlow had worked before his arrest. It was still boarded up. I broke in through a side door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faint smell of oil and rust clung to the walls. And that's where I found it. An old service receipt, tucked under a pile of dusty invoices. A receipt for a car belonging to Claire, dated 3 days after. She was murdered. That was impossible. My breath caught in my throat. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped the paper. If that receipt was real, it meant someone had been using her name, her car, after her death. From that moment, I knew the system wasn't going to give me justice. I had to take it myself. I began to follow Calder. I watched him leave the station, meet with shady characters in unmarked cars, and visit derelict warehouses on the edge of town. Always late, always looking over his shoulder. He wasn't just a dirty detective, and he was part of something much bigger. So, I started preparing, training. I studied the floor plans of the county penitentiary, the place where Harlow was being held. If he wasn't the real killer, then he was my only link to finding out who was. And if he was guilty, well, then I wanted to look him in the eye before I took justice into my own hands. They said no one could get in or out of that prison without a miracle. But I wasn't looking for a miracle. I was looking for a way. And when rage is your compass, there's always a way. I began to plot my infiltration, not like a thief, but like a man with nothing left to lose. It took months. A fake identity, forged credentials, and a volunteer position under a prison repair contract. The night before I went in, I sat at Claire's grave for hours. The autumn wind cut through my coat, scattering leaves over her headstone. I told her I'd bring her the truth, that I'd finish what the law had failed to do. As I walked away, the moonlight caught the inscription on her stone. Love is patient. I smiled bitterly. Not anymore, I whispered into the wind. That was the night I crossed the line. The night I stopped being a grieving widower and became a They called it the county penitentiary like it was an institution, a civic necessity wrapped in brick and bureaucratic boredom. To me, it was a different thing entirely, a cathedral of small cruelties, a place where the hours had been flattened until they looked like polished stone. My plan, such as it was, began not with explosives or daring, but with paperwork and patience. The kind of patience that comes from having nothing left to lose. I learned quickly that institutions are allergic to surprise. They inhale routine and exhale indifference. So I dressed myself in routine. A name tag with a name that was not mine, a uniform whose threads smelled faintly of bleach and gasoline, a practiced smile that belonged to a man who carried a wrench and not a funeral. I took a job on a night repair crew, men who came and went like shadows between the tall fences. I said little and watched everything. It was the safest lie I'd ever told, and it felt like a sacrament. The penitentiary at dusk looked like a painting of punishment. High walls swallowed the last of the sun. Watchtowers jabbed at the sky like crooked fingers, and the chain-link fences hummed with a metallic song whenever the wind passed through. The air carried the twin smells of cold iron and boiling coffee, of soap and something else. Fear, maybe, or habit. It was timeless, like the rest of my life had become. People performing old dances so the halls would believe they were alive. My first weeks were slow and precise. I learned the rhythms of key rattles, the cadence of the guards' jokes, where the shadow of the boiler room fell at 3 in the morning. I learned to make myself invisible by being useful, and useful by being unremarkable. The men on my crew were all faces with histories I didn't need to know. An old electrician who whistled off-key hymns, a young man who smoked like he inhaled urgency, a supervisor with permanent coffee rings under his nails. I listened. People say prisons shut down the world, but inside them stories multiply like mildew. Anger, regret, quiet hatred. I fed on those stories. I cataloged them like evidence because evidence, even the intangible kind, is how a man who wants truth will find it. The day I first saw him, I almost walked past without noticing. They kept the condemned in a section that smelled of paper and bleach, a place where time was folded into waiting. Harlow E.S. cell was one among many, a narrow rectangle with a bed and a sink and a small barred door. He was sitting on the cot, his eyes not on me but seemingly fixed on some point beyond the concrete. He looked younger than I expected, which is a dangerous thing for a man you imagine as monstrous. You have to build a monster in your mind to understand his actions, and youth doesn't fit in the mold. He had the kind of face that arranges itself into neutrality if you give it long enough. Small mouth, broad forehead, and ordinary jaw. Up close there were marks, a faint scar sawed along the cheek, a white puckered line at the knuckle of his left hand. He looked fragile and ironical at once, like a puppet whose strings had been frayed until the motions were honest. When he spoke, it was in a voice that surprised me by being small and unadorned, like someone reciting the weather. "You're new," he said without looking up. His accent was regional, a thread that made him both of this place and apart from it. "Maintenance back again?" I'd rehearsed what I'd say. I'd practiced the tilt of my head, the casual shrug that would hide anything dangerous. but rehearsed lines dissolve under the heat of an actual moment. My throat closed. I told him I was here to fix a leak, to stop a draft, things that did not matter. He nodded as if this explained a great deal, and then, as if testing the air, he said, "You don't look like you belong here." The truth, that sharp blade that had split my life, felt heavy in my mouth. There are moments when a face will tell you everything, and there are others when it will tell you nothing. Harlow's face told me things in both directions. There was a tiredness there that matched my own, a hollow that lived behind the eyes. I wanted to hate him like scripture commanded, but something in his silence asked me to wait. The months that followed were an exercise in patience and propinquity. I worked the break of night shifts so I could see faces at their most honest. The exhausted guards who muttered to themselves. The inmates who moved like marionettes on long, invisible strings. I learned the small betrayals that festered behind closed doors. The warden's fondness for a particular brand of cigar. The chaplain's quiet, sanctimonious gaze. The way petty favors could buy a moment of leniency. I learned that access is not a thing you force. It is a thing you bargain for, with smiles and fixtures and the slow drip of earned trust. I didn't expect to find anything neat. No confession scooped from a cracked brain. Instead, clues arrived like insects at a lamp. Small, persistent, and strange. A cigarette butt tucked behind a loose brick. No name, no paper. An envelope full of pictures folded with an absent hand. A woman smiling with eyes too familiar. A name scrawled in hurried ink on a repair order that matched a name I'd seen in Claire's journal. Each seemed insignificant until I laid them together and saw how they fit like stars mapping a constellation. There was a moment I still replay in my sleep. The night a storm came and the prison's power hiccuped, and everything smelled of wet stone. The dim emergency lights made the hallways soft, like the inside of a seashell. I was crouched under a service panel, forehead wet with the rain or sweat. Sometimes it is hard to tell which. When Harlow stepped into the corridor, he moved with a loping gait, not hurried, but not indifferent, and there was a bundle under his arm. He looked at me. For one searing heartbeat, our eyes met and the air shifted. He didn't glare or sneer. He said quietly, "You look different in low light." "You could say the same," I answered. It was the most daring thing I'd said in a long time. He smiled then, and it was small and human and utterly disarming. "People keep asking me why I sing in the yard," he said. "I sing because otherwise I'd hear the things I don't want to hear. You know that?" There was a sound in his throat like a laugh, but it wasn't joy. It was resignation, practiced until it was smooth. I wanted to roar at him, to force him into the story I had already told myself. Instead, I replied, "What do you sing?" He shrugged. "Old songs, things my mother used to hum, nothing you'd know." I felt a prickle at the base of my skull. He shouldn't have known Claire's taste in music. He shouldn't have known the melody that had been the last thing she'd sung to me in the kitchen as we argued about buying a house. But what if he knew that because everyone knew it? What if my logic had become a trap? That delicious circular thing where desire creates its own evidence. We stood like that for a long minute, two men with a gulf between them that felt like a canyon. I tried then, miserably and humanly, to find a crack in his certainty. I asked about the day of Claire's death, questions a good prosecutor would avoid but a hungry husband would not. Harlow's answers were measured, the sort of answers that refuse to give more than they must. He spoke of the court, of lawyers' faces that have the shape of old coins. He said nothing of the mechanics of the crime. He never volunteered the kind of confession my anger craved. As I left, he said one thing that became a kernel in my head. Truth and story are different things. People like stories better. They cover up the places where truth is inconvenient. I wanted to break him then, to tear his sentences apart and find the man beneath. Instead, I walked back into the night and listened to the rain, letting that small, disarming sentiment take root. It was impossible to know if it was the truth or the lonely trick of a condemned man. But either way, it shifted something inside me. Maybe my crusade would need more than fury. Maybe it would require listening the way thieves listen for the faintest clink before a safe is opened. Maybe the blueprint of revenge had to be drafted not in rage alone, but in the patient, painstaking collection of human detail. When I turned away from his cell that night, the corridor hummed in the dim light like a throat that had swallowed a long, hard secret. I walked back to my cot and cataloged everything I'd felt and seen, because grief had taught me to pay attention to the subtlest of things. The plan, such as it now existed, was taking a new shape. It was no longer just about punishing a monster. It was about excavating a truth that might have been buried beneath other people's comfortable stories. There was, I knew, another name in the margins of Claire's life. There was a detective who wore respectability like armor, and in the margins of that armor, rusted edges. I had come into the penitentiary with a blueprint drawn in anger. By the time I left that night, I had added instruments of patience and the willingness to be alone for the better part of a lifetime. In the dark that followed, the thing I had sworn to do was no longer just simple revenge. It had become a meticulous, slow-burning confession I would force the world to hear. The sound that wakes you in prison isn't always the clanging of bars. Sometimes it's quieter. A cough, a whispered name, the shuffle of paper in the dark. By the third month inside, I'd learned the building's private language. Every echo, every breath, meant something. The place was alive in its own cruel rhythm, and if you listened long enough, it spoke back. I began to notice how the walls themselves carried secrets. The concrete corridors weren't smooth. They were layered with paint and neglect. Air vents hummed with half-heard conversations from blocks away. Through them, I learned who smuggled cigarettes, who owed favors, who was due for transfer. And one night, while replacing a rusted grate behind the laundry room, I heard my own name. Not the name on my forged badge, my real name. I froze. Two voices, both low and sharp, echoing through the ductwork. "He's not a regular. Doesn't talk like one." "Yeah, I checked. No file before last month. Somebody's placed him." They didn't say who. The sound of keys jangled, footsteps faded, and I was left staring into the dark. That was the moment I realized my cover wasn't as airtight as I believed. Someone inside had begun pulling at the threads of my disguise. Whether it was a guard, an inmate, or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. But it meant I had less time than I'd planned. That night I found an unlikely ally. A man named Briggs, the boiler technician. He was heavy-set, slow to speak, and always smelled faintly of diesel. We'd shared coffee in silence for weeks. When he finally talked, it was like a valve releasing steam. "You ain't from around here," he said, eyes fixed on the glowing gauge. "Neither are you," I answered. He smiled. "Difference is, I stopped pretending I belong. You still think you can." He didn't press and I didn't confess. But from that night on, Briggs became a buffer. He'd give me warnings about inspections, guard rotations, anything that might expose me. He didn't ask for money or favors, just the truth, in installments, like a story he wanted to hear at his own pace. Each rumor was a thread, and I was learning to weave. The warden, a tall man with thinning hair and a smile that belonged to politics, called for a new inspection round one morning. I joined the team that checked locks and electrical boxes. The inspection was supposed to be routine, but that's when I found it. A narrow crawl space behind cell C12, sealed by an old maintenance hatch. The blueprint said nothing about it. I waited until midnight to return. With Briggs keeping watch, I pried open the hatch and slipped inside. The air was thick with dust and the metallic smell of forgotten places. My flashlight beam caught something strange. A tangle of wires, a small microphone taped under a loose brick, and a recorder the size of a paperback. Someone had been listening to the inmates, not the administration but someone else. I pressed play, at first nothing, then a faint voice, a woman's, trembling, almost drowned by static. "Grant, listen, you have to tell him. They'll come for both of us if—" The recording cut off. The rest was white noise. But the voice, it wasn't Claire's, and yet it carried the same edge of fear I'd once heard in her diary. The next morning I confronted Harlow through the bars. "You ever hear of a woman leaving messages for you?" I asked. He studied me for a long time, like a man measuring the weight of a stone before deciding whether to throw it. "You shouldn't be asking that," he said. "Why not?" "Because you already know more than they want you to." I pressed him harder, but he only laughed, a dry, joyless sound. "You think you're the only one crawling through this place's veins? There are people who built careers making ghosts out of the living. You start pulling on that wire, you'll end up a ghost too." Before I could answer, a guard shouted my alias from down the hall. "Inspection duty." The moment was gone. Later that day, Briggs handed me an envelope. "Found this stuck under your toolbox," he said. Inside was a single photograph. Claire standing beside Detective Calder, smiling for a newspaper piece about community safety outreach. The date stamp was just 2 weeks before she died. On the back, scrawled in ink, "Ask Harlow about the bridge." That night, the prison felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. I couldn't tell if I was following clues or being led. The line between hunter and prey blurred somewhere in the stale air of that cell block. As I lay on my cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, I realized that revenge wasn't a straight road. It was a spiral, and I was already too deep in its turns to see the way out. Still, I couldn't stop. The next step was clear. I had to find out what the bridge meant and whether the woman's voice on that tape was connected to Claire's final days. But to do that, I'd have to move beyond maintenance routes, into restricted areas patrolled by guards who didn't sleep. And to survive that, I'd need more than courage. I'd need an accomplice inside the inmate ranks. That east, when I decided to make contact with the one man the guards feared even more than the condemned, a lifer named Dalton, who ran half the trades in the prison from behind his bars. If information existed, Dalton could sell it. But every purchase had a price, and I was about to find out just how steep. Dalton's reputation traveled faster than footsteps. You didn't need to see him to feel the orbit he created. Conversations shortened when his name came up. Guards shifted keys in their hands, and even the boldest inmates measured their tone. He was a lifer, which in this place meant he'd outlasted both the rules and the people who wrote them. They said he'd once been a dock foreman who turned a smuggling charge into an empire of favors. Inside these walls, that empire still breathed. It took me 3 days to arrange a meeting. You couldn't simply walk up to Dalton's cell. You had to be invited, as if stepping into a private kingdom. The cell block where Dalton lived felt older than the rest of the prison. Colder too, the stones darker with age. When I arrived, Dalton was seated on his cot, rolling a small chess piece between his fingers. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, like the marble itself had borrowed his stare. "You've been looking for me," he said before I could speak. "Maybe," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. He smiled. "Everyone here looks for me sooner or later. You want contraband, a letter out, a secret in. Which are you?" "Information," I said, "about a bridge." That got his attention. The chess piece stopped spinning. "Bridge?" he repeated, tasting the word like it was part of an old memory. "That's a strange thing to ask about in a place with no exits." I leaned against the bars. Someone told me it mattered. Someone who isn't supposed to know my name. He studied me quietly, long enough that I began to hear the faint tick of a dripping pipe somewhere beyond us. "You're not one of the guards," he said finally. "You walk like a man counting seconds. So tell me, what makes the bridge so important?" I hesitated. Lying to Dalton seemed dangerous, telling the full truth even more so. I settled somewhere in between. My wife died near one. I think the man who's supposed to be guilty isn't. I think the bridge is where the truth begins. Dalton's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. A flicker of something like recognition. "You're talking about the Willow Creek span," he murmured. "Long since closed. Wasn't just a bridge, it was a drop point. Police used it for quiet exchanges, evidence, informants, sometimes people. Used by who? Same men who pretend they don't remember it," he said, a faint grin curling at the corner of his mouth. "You might be walking in deeper water than you realize." He rose, a slow unfolding of muscle and certainty, and took a step closer to the bars. "I can tell you what you want, but I don't sell words cheap. You'll owe me. What do you want? He pointed to a bundle of paper tucked under the bunk. Blueprints for the new maintenance tunnels. You've seen them. Bring me a copy, no more, no less, then you get your story about the bridge. He turned away before I could answer, dismissing me like a clerk closing a ledger. The conversation was over. I walked out under the stare of the guards, feeling the weight of another secret added to the stack I already carried. Back in the boiler room, Briggs whistled low when I told him, "Blueprints, that's not a favor, that's bait. You sure he's not setting you up?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But he knows something, and I can't stop now." The next week was a blur of quiet theft and disguised purpose. I memorized what I could of the tunnel maps during my shifts, then sketched them by hand in the dark, recreating the paths and service lines as best I could. Each line felt like a confession written in graphite. When I handed the folded pages to Dalton, he didn't even look down at them. He simply said, "Meet me in the chapel tomorrow night." The prison chapel was the one place where silence felt voluntary. The walls were high, the air faintly perfumed with old wax and dust. I arrived just after lights out, the corridor behind me lit by the dull glow of emergency lamps. Dalton was already there, standing beside the altar, his silhouette framed against the dim, stained glass. "I liked your work," he said softly. "You draw straight lines. Straight lines mean you still believe in order. That's admirable. Tell me about the bridge." He nodded toward a pew. "Sit. It's not a short story." I sat. His voice dropped to a whisper that seemed too calm for what he described. "Years ago, before I landed here, the police and a handful of businessmen ran a quiet arrangement. The bridge at Willow Creek was their border. Evidence traded for silence, favors exchanged under the roar of traffic. A detective named Calder was the courier. He handled things that couldn't see daylight. Then one night something went wrong. A woman showed up, thought she was meeting a journalist. She found Calder instead. By morning she was gone. They buried the scandal under another man's crime. My throat tightened. "You're sure of this?" Dalton leaned forward until the light caught the fine lines on his face. "I was one of Calder's suppliers. I heard the argument that night over the radio feed. I heard her name." He paused, letting the space between syllables stretch. "Claire." It was like the floor shifted, my chest filled with the same cold I felt the day the detective told me she was dead. I wanted to speak, to shout, but Dalton raised a hand. "You came here for revenge," he said. "But if you want truth, you'll have to live long enough to use it. Calder still walks free because the files that prove what he did are hidden in the same tunnels you just drew for me." He stepped back, his face now unreadable. "Now you know why I wanted them. I need proof too. Proof that keeps men like Calder from erasing the rest of us." I left the chapel without looking back. The air outside tasted of rain and metal. The map I'd drawn was no longer just a drawing. It was a path to the truth, or to a place that would finally consume me. That night, as thunder rolled over the distant hills, I sat on my cot and thought about Dalton's words. The bridge, the files, Calder. Every piece of it fit too perfectly, but the perfection itself made me uneasy. In stories like these, perfection is often a lie. Still, the next step was clear. If the proof existed in the tunnels, I'd have to find it before Dalton or anyone else could use it against me. I told myself it was justice. Deep down, I knew it was something far simpler. The need to hear Claire S. name cleared of all the echoes that haunted it. They tell you prisons are built to keep people in, but they never speak about what else they keep. Secrets folded into the mortar, paper pressed against stone, the smell of deals that lived beneath the painted surfaces. The maintenance tunnels beneath the penitentiary were like the underbelly of a sleeping animal, dark, damp, and full of the slow, patient heartbeat of things nobody wanted to see. I had the map in my pocket and a single, brittle hope in my chest. That first descent was nothing like the bravado I'd rehearsed. There was no cinematic lowering of ropes, no grand act of defiance. There was only a rusted ladder, a mouth of blackness, and the way the hot breath of the prison felt like the last warm thing before you went under. I climbed down with hands that didn't stop trembling until my shoulder blades pressed against cold stone. The tunnel swallowed sound. Every step felt magnified, every breath a potential witness. Briggs had given me an old flashlight with a smear on the lens so the light would be soft. The kind of small mercy that became important when you were trying not to be seen. The tunnels smelled of damp cardboard and old coal, and there were places where water made a slow music against the pipes. I moved by memory, and by the crude sketch I'd made on stolen paper. Each junction brought a decision, and the knowledge that a wrong turn could lead me into the hands of men who patrolled the underground like wolves. I wasn't alone down there. Other men had reasons to be in the dark, rats with favors owed, a guard who liked to duck below when the lights were on his knees, and men whose faces I had only seen in the yard. Dalton had done me a favor, or maybe a professional courtesy, and left a small coded mark on a drainage grate only I would look for. That tiny gesture felt like a benediction, proof that I was still walking a path agreed upon by the inhabitants of the underside. The further we went, the less the prison seemed like an institution and more like a city of subterfuge. There were makeshift markers, tiny cairns of wire, a cigarette butt tucked in a crack to show a way. I kept expecting the tunnel to end in a locked vault full of neat, labeled folders, but life is rarely tidy. What I found instead were fragments, a soggy folder stamped with the courthouse seal, a Polaroid curled at the edges, a ledger with names half rubbed by water. Each was a voice snatched from being thrown away. The first file I pried open was less incriminating than I'd hoped. It contained invoices for supplies, signatures that were careful, and a notation that could have been nothing. I felt that old familiar cold of doubt creep back in. Part of me wanted to throw the folder to the rats and walk away. Part of me wanted to drag every thin paper into the light until the truth bled out. I chose to keep going. There would be no clean answers, only accumulations of small things that, when stacked together, made a shape. At one junction, I heard voices, too soft for the surface, held tight by the tunnel walls. A guard voice threaded through, low and conspiratorial, and then another, unfamiliar in cadence. I flattened myself against a sluice, heart pounding like a drum. The men passed close enough that I could smell tobacco on their breath. I lay there as they argued about transfer lists and the fine points of who owed who a favor. One of them mentioned Calder by name, lightly, like a man discussing the weather. That tiny mention felt like a blade sliding into old wood. It warmed and cut at once. The deeper we went, the more I realized the tunnels were a borderland, a place where units of power crossed without witnesses. People moved contraband, messages, small tokens of protection. The bridge at Willow Creek had been the surface equivalent of this underworld, a hidden channel where respectability laundered its sins. To walk these tunnels was to follow the veins of a living lie. Then I found the ledger that changed the tone of everything. Tucked inside an oil-stained toolbox, wrapped in plastic that had once held a sandwich, was a list of dates and initials. Next to several entries were short notes: delivered, received, held. Beside one row, hurried and nearly illegible, someone had scribbled Claire M. Gift, W.C. Span. My hands went numb. The paper was brittle, but the words were clear. I took the ledger like a thief and read until my eyes blurred. The initials matched signatures I'd seen on other papers tied to Detective Calder. Dates clustered around the month Claire died. It was not the smoking gun. There is rarely a single perfect object that ends a story. But it was a ledger, the bureaucratic heartbeat of a network. It said that transactions had been logged, that favors had been exchanged, and that names I recognized, men who smiled in public and wore clean collars, were present in the margins. There was a sound behind me like the scuff of a shoe. I slammed the ledger closed and stuffed it into my jacket. Everything in me turned to silence. I moved through the tunnel on hands and feet, the flashlight clutched tight to my chest. The exit I'd planned was a faint rectangle of light in the distance, like the mouth of a creature that might eat me or save me. When I reached the ladder up, my palms were raw and my breath ragged. I emerged into the prison service yard, as if surfacing from the sea. The night air felt too bright, too truthful. Above me, stars pricked the sky, indifferent. I made my way back to the boiler room where Briggs waited, his face carved of diesel and shadow. "You look like hell," he said. "I found something," I managed, handing him the ledger. His hands trembled as he flipped the pages. "This is big," he whispered. "This will make men move." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, a heavy dread settled over me. The ledger was proof, but proof wanted to be used. And once you used it, you were no longer a man observing the world. You were a man in it, with enemies and friends and fines to pay. Dalton had warned me that workers of truth sometimes become currency. I'd come down here thinking I could hold the ledger like a stone and throw it at the feet of Calder. Now the ledger felt like a live coal I couldn't set down. We debated options in whispers. Hand it to Dalton? Use it to confront Calder? Make it public and watch the town convulse? Briggs suggested patience. "You drop this into the world too soon," he said, "and you'll be pinning your hopes on people who already know how to smile while their pockets are full." There was another problem I hadn't fully faced: escape. The ledger was an explosive. Men would die for it and because of it. The tunnels had taught me that the world beneath the prison had ways of responding that were both slow and lethal. I resolved, with the stubborn finality of a man who had already crossed a line, that I would not hand it to anyone whose motives I couldn't smell. Dalton was useful, but his usefulness was bought and sold like everything else in that place. That night I lay awake on my cot and thought of Claire's laugh, the way she used to say my name in kitchens and cold mornings. I thought of detectives who carry uniforms like armor, and of the polite faces in the town square. The ledger gave me a way to begin, but it did not promise the end I wanted. It was an opening, jagged and dangerous, and I had to decide how to push through it. In the end, I chose a compromise between patience and action. I would use the ledger like a lantern, not a weapon. Let it light a path to answers rather than be thrown in blind fury. I would confront men with truth shaped carefully, not hurled like an accusation. But even as I made that decision, I knew there was one final intimacy to be had with the ledger. I needed the rest of the story. There would be names I didn't recognize, dates that defied context, and hands that had been clever about washing themselves. The tunnels had given me a map. Now I needed to read the handwriting carefully. And beneath all of it was a quieter fear, that the ledger was only one ledger, one small page in a book of organized silence. Sometimes the truth is not one thing but an industry, and dismantling that industry takes more than ledger pages. It takes courage, cunning, and the slow, terrible willingness to make people uncomfortable enough that they stop pretending. The next morning, as fog wrapped the yard in a white shawl, I tucked the ledger into the hollow of my jacket and walked to work with the weight of an additional life stitched to my side. The tunnels beneath had given me proof, but they had also given me something else. An understanding that the line between uncovering the truth and becoming part of the machinery that hides it is thin as a cracked floor tile. When I finally stepped beyond the prison walls, the sky had that dull color of ash and iron, the kind that promised neither rain nor mercy. Freedom should have felt like air, like wind rushing into a starved body. But for me, it came with the same suffocating stillness as the tunnels. Only now, the silence had trees, distant rooftops, and the faint toll of a church bell that didn't care who was listening. I had escaped, but I hadn't left. You don't walk away from a place like Blackridge, you drag its fingerprints with you. Every corner, every lamppost felt like it was watching. Even the dogs barked like they knew I didn't belong on this side of the fence anymore. I took the back roads, the ones that ran parallel to the main streets but never quite met them. The ledger pressed against my ribs beneath my coat, its edges biting into my skin with each step. I'd memorized most of what was inside, but that didn't make it any lighter. Each name carried weight: judges, businessmen, policemen, men who pretended to hold up the world while their hands were busy pulling strings. My first stop was the outskirts of Willow Creek. The bridge was gone now, or at least the wooden skeleton of it was. The authorities had torn it down 2 years after Claire's death, calling it a safety hazard. I knew better. They tore it down because the sight of it reminded too many people of what they had tried to forget. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the wind carried the smell of wet leaves and old secrets. The creek gurgled quietly, oblivious to the ghosts it carried. I stood there for a long time, staring at the black water, the place where my wife had died, where her laughter had been swallowed whole by the same system that was supposed to protect her. That's when I saw the figure on the far bank, tall, broad-shouldered, coat flapping against the current of the breeze. At first I thought it was a trick of memory, my brain stitching together faces I'd imagined 1,000 times. But when he turned, I saw it clearly. Calder, the detective, the man who had smiled at me the day they told me Claire's killer had taken his own life, in custody. He wasn't supposed to be here. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only thing between us was that narrow ribbon of water, but it might as well have been a canyon. He raised a hand, not in greeting, not even in warning. It was the slow, deliberate lift of a man who knew he was being watched and wanted to look unafraid. "Long way from home, aren't you?" His voice carried easily over the water. "Home burned down a long time ago," I said. He smiled faintly, as if that answer had confirmed something for him. "You've been busy." I didn't bother denying it. "You've been comfortable," I said instead. His eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't have come back here, Mason. You're not built for this kind of game." I wanted to tell him that I didn't come back to play, that this wasn't a game, but I could feel my pulse in my throat pounding like the echo of a verdict. "I came for answers," I said. He laughed softly. "Then you've already lost." The wind shifted, and for a heartbeat I thought he might draw a weapon. But instead, Calder just adjusted his coat, gave me a long, knowing look, and turned to walk away down the embankment. I wanted to chase him, to drag him down into the same mud where he'd buried my wife's name. But a small, rational voice in me said, "Not yet. You don't chase wolves in their own woods. You wait until the wind changes." I spent that night in an abandoned mill near the outskirts of town. The machinery had long since rusted to silence, but the walls were sturdy and the roof didn't leak. I built a fire out of old ledgers and splinters, ironic, given what I carried. The orange light threw long, ghostly shapes across the walls. I spread the ledger out in front of me and read again, trying to piece together what Calder had meant. He'd said, "You've already lost," which meant something was already in motion, something I didn't see. The more I read, the clearer it became that Calder wasn't just protecting a single killer. He was guarding an entire circle, men who had used the prison as a revolving door, a place to make inconvenient people disappear. My wife's death had been an error, an unplanned ripple, but instead of fixing it, they'd folded it into the system, framed a man, silenced him, and called it closure. But the part that chilled me most wasn't the conspiracy. It was the pattern. Every 3 years, the ledger showed transfers between the same 3 names, Calder, Wesson, and a judge named Harland Pike. The notations were coded, but I recognized the pattern of amounts, the way the handwriting shifted slightly when signed under stress. Wesson was the prison warden. Pike was the judge who denied my appeal. And Calder was the man who had convinced me to stop asking questions after Claire's death. 3 men rotating power, cleaning up after each other. I couldn't fight them all, not directly, but I didn't need to. I just needed to cut the thread that held them together. And that's where I made my first real mistake. I reached out to someone I thought I could trust, Evelyn Sharp, a journalist I'd known before the walls. She had written about the prison once, exposing the abuse of inmates and the smuggling of contraband. I thought she could help me bring the ledger into the light without it being buried. We met 2 nights later at the edge of town, near an old diner that had long since closed. She arrived late, her headlights sweeping across the empty parking lot like searching eyes. She looked thinner than I remembered, more cautious, but her eyes still carried that same fire, the kind that made you believe words could still change things. "Mason," she whispered when she saw me. "You're supposed to be gone. Guess I'm bad at leaving things behind." I handed her the ledger, wrapped in cloth. Her hands shook slightly as she took it. "What is this?" "Proof," I said. "The kind that burns slowly but kills completely." She glanced around, her breath visible in the cold. Do you know what happens if this gets out? I know what happens if it doesn't. For a moment, she looked at me with something between admiration and fear. You always were the kind who couldn't sleep with ghosts. Maybe that's because they don't stop talking. She smiled faintly, but it faded quickly. I'll look through it, but if you're right, you won't be able to hide after this. They'll come for you. They already have. I turned to leave, but she stopped me. Mason, don't disappear again. If you do, make sure it's on your terms. Her words lingered long after I was gone. That night, as I walked through the empty streets, I felt the cold shift in the air, that subtle sense that something had already changed. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was loaded. A soundless countdown ticking behind every rustle of leaves. By morning, Evelyn was gone. No calls, no letters, no ledger, only a half-burned newspaper by my window with a headline that read, "Local journalist missing after anonymous tip." My blood turned to ice. They had her. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't hunting ghosts anymore. The ghosts were hunting me. Morning arrived without warmth. The kind of dawn that doesn't rise. It creeps like it's afraid of what it might find in the light. I hadn't slept. My mind spun between Evelyn I.'s last words and the echo of the fire I'd seen in my dreams. There are moments when silence is so heavy it feels like punishment. That was one of them. The safe house was small, more a shell than a room. Bare walls, one window clouded with grime. The floor uneven as if it had been built by trembling hands. I sat in the dark for hours, listening to the tick of cooling pipes. Every sound was amplified. A rat in the corner, wind sliding through cracks, the rhythm of my pulse. Evelyn's disappearance had hollowed out the night and left me inside it. When I couldn't stand the waiting any longer, I went back to the diner where we'd met. The place was desolate, a skeleton of rusted signage and half-buried gravel. Her car was gone, but the ground told its story. Fresh tire tracks cut deep into the mud, a faint trail of oil that glistened under the morning light. They led toward the woods. I followed them. The forest was silent except for the sound of my boots breaking frost. The deeper I went, the thicker the smell of fuel became. Then the world opened into a clearing, and I saw what remained. A vehicle. Twisted metal, glass melted to ash, flames long gone but their memory still hanging in the air. The license plate was barely intact, and the sight of it made something inside me lock into place. Evelyn's car. The fire hadn't been random. It was meticulous, calculated. The kind of burn that's done to signal something, not conceal it. The engine block was scorched through, the windows blown out, but there was no body, no blood. Just absence. That small vacancy was both mercy and cruelty. I circled the wreck in slow, deliberate steps, scanning the ground. There was a footprint near the edge of the road, half pressed into damp earth. Standard prison issue, thick tread, heavy heel. It pointed back toward Black Ridge. The place had a way of reaching for people, even outside its walls. By the time I made it back to the safe house, night was pulling itself over the town again. The sky was bruised purple, and the air carried a faint hum, like the whole world was holding its breath. I lit the small stove in the corner and stared into the flame until shapes began to move in the shadows. One of them stepped forward. Dalton. He wasn't wearing the uniform anymore. Just a plain coat, collar turned up, face half lost to the flicker of light. He looked older, thinner, like a man who'd been sleeping with one eye open for too long. I didn't need to ask why he was there. The ledger had pulled him in just as it had drawn everyone else. He didn't speak right away, and neither did I. The fire filled the silence between us. I watched him, waiting for some sign of what side he'd chosen this time. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, thin, worn, the edges darkened from handling. Transfers, 4 names, all scheduled for that night. My eyes froze on one of them. Harper Quinn. I hadn't seen that name since Claire's letters, the ones that never reached me. Harper had been her friend inside those walls, the only one who tried to tell me the truth after she died. Every letter she'd sent had been intercepted, hidden, buried. Now her name was moving again, alive on the page. Dalton left as quietly as he arrived. I didn't stop him. There were no promises left between us, only debts neither of us could pay. When the last trace of his footsteps vanished, I unfolded the map I kept inside my jacket. The route of the prison convoy stretched like a scar across the countryside, winding through the quarry road before disappearing into the hills. It was always the same pattern: late departure, no witnesses, a few accidents along the way. By midnight, I was there. The road was narrow, flanked by dead trees and the remains of old mines. The air smelled of diesel and cold iron. I waited, engine off, headlights low, the night pressing against the windows. And then, faintly, came the hum of approaching trucks, two of them moving steady, black silhouettes against the moonlight. The kind of quiet procession meant to go unseen. I followed from a distance, every muscle taut. The road curved sharply near the quarry, and that's where it happened. The first truck stopped. The second slowed, angled across the lane to block passage. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. And then I saw him. Calder. He stood beside the truck, his shape framed by the dim light spilling from the cab. Calm, composed, as though the night itself bent around him. He didn't need to shout to make himself heard. He just waited, the way men do when they already believe they've won. There are moments in life when instinct overrides logic. I don't remember deciding to move. My body just acted. I pushed the car door open, slipped into the ditch, kept low. Gravel crunched softly underfoot as I advanced through the brush. Then, chaos. Engines roared, lights flared, shouts broke through the dark. I heard the sharp crack of gunfire. Short bursts, not random but controlled. The trucks jolted, one swerving off the road. Smoke rose in a thick, suffocating wave. Somewhere in the confusion, Calder's figure retreated, unhurried, like a shadow stepping back into its source. When the noise faded, I moved closer. The overturned truck was still groaning, metal cooling, its back doors hanging open. Inside were faces, half-starved, dazed, blinking against the light. Inmates, ghosts of the system, and among them, one that stopped me cold. Harper. She was thinner, older, her eyes ringed with exhaustion but still fierce enough to cut through the dark. I helped her down, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The air around us smelled of oil and dust, and somewhere a siren wailed, distant and fading. She gripped my sleeve with surprising strength. Her voice, when it came, was a rasp. "They're moving the journalist." Those words landed like a blow. Evelyn. Harper's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the road stretched back toward Blackridge. "They keep them alive until the paperwork is gone. Then they vanish them." It wasn't hope she was giving me. It was a warning. As dawn began to claw its way through the trees, I helped her to her feet. Behind us, the wrecked trucks hissed quietly, the night's violence cooling into silence. I looked toward the faint glow of the prison on the horizon. It no longer felt like a place. It felt like a pulse, steady and waiting, still connected to everything I loved and everything I'd lost. They wanted me to stop digging. Instead, they'd given me a shovel. The hunt had changed direction. Now, I was the one closing in. The world after the explosion felt distorted, like time itself was breathing unevenly. Every sound seemed delayed by half a second, every shadow too long, every breath caught between disbelief and exhaustion. Harper and I made it through the woods before sunrise, our silhouettes stretching across the mist like fading ghosts. She moved slower than I remembered. Prison drains something from people. It doesn't just take years, it rewires the way they move, the way they look at open space. Yet there was a steadiness to her, a kind of quiet defiance that mirrored my own. Maybe that's why I trusted her, even when logic whispered that trust had no place left in my life. We reached an abandoned train yard by dawn. The rails were rusted, the air thick with iron and rot. Old freight cars sat lined like coffins under broken beams. It was a graveyard of movement, a perfect place to disappear for a while. Harper crouched near a rusted drum and began unwrapping a bundle sheet D taken from the truck. Documents sealed in waterproof casing, a hard drive wrapped in cloth, and a small photograph tucked inside. I recognized the man in the picture immediately. Calder, but next to him stood another figure, blurred, slightly out of focus, yet familiar enough to twist something deep in my gut. Dalton. I'd suspected it for a long time. But suspicion and confirmation are two different poisons. One makes you sick, the other kills you outright. Harper said nothing. She didn't have to. The truth was bleeding through her silence. Dalton hadn't just been helping Calder. He'd been working with him long before my infiltration. The ledger wasn't something I stumbled upon. It was bait. The whole operation was a trap designed to flush out anyone chasing Claire's death. And I had walked right into it. I stared at the photo until my fingers started to tremble. Dalton had been the one who smuggled me in, the one who whispered about justice, redemption, and exposing corruption. Every word he spoke had been a line in a script written long before I ever arrived. Harper watched me carefully, as if gauging whether I'd break. Her voice, when it finally came, was low and steady. "You weren't supposed to make it out, Mason. None of us were." I wanted to deny it, but the memories lined up too perfectly. The unguarded routes, the conveniently timed alarms, the escape that felt almost too easy. They hadn't lost control of me. They'd let me run knowing I'd lead them somewhere, but why? I stared out at the yard, watching fog coil around the rails. The answer came not as logic, but as a feeling. Cold. Inevitable. They weren't after me. They were after Evelyn. She was the one digging too deep into the prison's funding, tracing its shadow accounts, connecting it to private contractors that didn't officially exist. I'd thought I was chasing her kidnappers. The truth was, she'd been the bait all along. Harper slid the hard drive toward me. This is what she was trying to upload. Everything. Names, transactions, transfers. She almost made it out before they caught her. I took the drive. It felt heavier than metal. Somewhere inside that small device was the weight of every lie that had destroyed my life. We stayed there until night fell again, the day swallowed by a slow-moving fog. I tried to rest, but the past kept replaying. Claire's laughter, Evelyn's eyes, Dalton's quiet smile in the dim light of the cell. Every memory was a blade turned inward. When I woke, Harper was gone. At first, I thought she'd gone for water or to scout the perimeter. But then I saw it. The tracks in the dirt, small, deliberate, leading toward the east exit. Her footprints overlapped with another pair, boots larger, heavier. I followed them across the yard, heart hammering, and stopped when I saw the flicker of headlights through the fog. 2 vehicles, black, no plates. One of them had a shattered taillight, the same truck Calder had used at the quarry. I moved closer, keeping low behind an old rail car. Through the cracked window, I saw Harper standing by the truck, her hands bound, face tilted toward the man who had undone everything I thought I knew. Dalton. He looked different now. Clean-cut, composed, the roughness gone. The kind of man who belonged in boardrooms, not cell blocks. I saw it all in a flash. His handshake with Calder, his silence when I'd asked about Evelyn's disappearance, the strange calm he carried even in chaos. He wasn't the broken guard who regretted his sins. He was the architect of the game. I strained to hear, but their voices were muffled by the hum of engines. Still, a few words reached me through the haze. Transfer tonight. Primary witness. Containment protocol. Then Dalton handed something to the driver, a small silver flash drive, and turned away. The convoy began to move. For a moment I stood frozen. The part of me that had lived in rage wanted to storm forward, to tear through them until I found her. But the part of me that had learned survival whispered caution. If Dalton had built the web, then the only way to destroy it was from its center, not its edges. As the trucks disappeared into the fog, I noticed something gleaming faintly where Dalton had been standing. I walked over and picked it up. A ring. Not his. Mine. The same ring that had been taken from me when I first entered Black Ridge. That meant one thing. They'd kept everything from the start. Every move, every letter, every secret. They'd known I'd come for revenge before I even knew it myself. The truth was simple and terrifying. I wasn't the hunter. I was the experiment. I looked toward the highway where the lights faded into the distance. Somewhere out there, Evelyn was still alive. maybe as bait, maybe as proof of how far I'd go. And Dalton was waiting, knowing I'd follow, because that's exactly what he'd designed me to do. But there's one thing he hadn't accounted for. I wasn't the same man who entered that cell, and this time I wasn't breaking in to expose the truth. I was breaking in to end it. I reached the outskirts of the city by nightfall, a place where glass towers rose like polished tombstones against the clouds. Blackridge wasn't just a prison, it was a system, a machine powered by money, secrecy, and men like Dalton. And the heart of that machine was right here. The skyline pulsed with the rhythm of rain and neon. Streetlights flickered over empty intersections, reflecting in puddles that looked like liquid mirrors. I moved through the alleyways in silence, a ghost among the living, guided only by the coordinates Harper had hidden in the hard drive before she was taken. They led me to a corporate building, anonymous, sterile, no name on the door. The kind of place that looked harmless enough to make you trust it. Security was tight but predictable. Patterns, habits, human error. Those were my weapons now. I slipped inside through the underground access, moving through corridors that smelled faintly of bleach and machine oil. Cameras turned like slow predators, their red lights blinking in rhythm with my pulse. Each step forward felt like retracing a nightmare I'd already lived. The walls were too white, the silence too absolute. It reminded me of the cell block, same geometry, same coldness, same invisible eyes watching from above. At the end of the hall, I found it. A room labeled Archives Restricted. The door was sealed with biometric access, but the system was old. I'd seen its model inside the prison. Standard pattern, easily bypassed if you knew where to touch. I pressed the contact points, waited for the green flicker, and the lock released with a muted click. Inside, the air was colder. Rows of file cabinets stood like sentinels, and at the far end, a single console glowed in the dark. The hum of its cooling fan was the only sound. I sat before it, slid Harper's drive into the port, and waited for the system to react. For a moment, nothing. Then lines of data began to spill across the screen. Names, dates, account codes, transactions. Millions moved through shell companies, redirected into the construction of facilities across the country. And among the coded entries, one name kept appearing. C. Harlow. Claire. My hand froze. I scrolled faster, disbelief tightening into a knot of dread. Her name was listed not as a victim, but as a beneficiary. Each file confirmed it. Transfers under her account, dated before her death. She wasn't just connected to Blackridge, she was part of it. The realization hit like a body blow. No, it couldn't be. I opened one of the encrypted folders linked to her ID. Inside was a video file, the timestamp, 1 week before she'd been reported dead. I pressed play. The screen flickered, and there she was, Claire, alive, sitting at a metal table under harsh fluorescent light. Her face was pale but calm, eyes sharp and unbroken. "Mason," she said, her voice steady, deliberate, like she knew exactly who would watch. "If you're seeing this, they've already turned me into a story you can mourn. Don't. What I did was never about survival. It was about exposure. The system needs its villains, and I chose to become one." My breath caught. She continued, her words precise, rehearsed. Blackridge wasn't built to contain criminals. It was built to erase evidence. Every inmate tied to the fund transfers, every journalist who got close. It all runs through this ledger. I was part of it, but I thought I could fix it from the inside. I was wrong, so I made them believe I was dead. I needed you to stop chasing ghosts. I needed you safe. The video ended abruptly, replaced by a black screen bearing a single line of text. Project Harlow. The cursor blinked beneath it, waiting for a command. For a long time, I couldn't move. My mind replayed every moment. The grief, the anger, the endless nights spent imagining vengeance. All of it had been orchestrated, calibrated to keep me running in circles. Claire hadn't been killed. She'd disappeared herself. And the worst part? Dalton had known. He'd used that truth as the leash around my neck, guiding me wherever he needed me to go. I stood slowly, the room tilting around me. The truth didn't feel like victory. It felt like suffocation. Then the console beeped. A message appeared across the screen. Access detected. Trace initiated. They knew I was here. I yanked the drive free, slipped it into my jacket, and turned toward the door. The corridor lights outside were already dimming, one by one, like eyes closing. Footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the bend. Steady, methodical. Dalton. He stepped into view with that same unnerving calm, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence was weapon enough. "You were never supposed to see that," he said, voice low, almost weary. "She wanted to protect you from this, Mason. You could have walked away." I didn't answer. The air between us was heavy with everything unsaid. Betrayal, loyalty, love twisted into strategy. He took a step closer. "You think this is about revenge. It's not. It's about containment. The truth doesn't set anyone free. It destroys stability. And people like Claire understood that better than anyone." The words fell like stones. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had understood. But understanding doesn't erase the cost. I moved toward the side exit, and his tone hardened. "You can't win this. You expose the system and you burn with it. That's why she stayed underground. That's why she let you believe she was gone." I turned back, meeting his eyes. For the first time, I saw something beneath the composure. Fatigue. Maybe even guilt. "She underestimated one thing," I said quietly. "What a man becomes when he has nothing left to lose." He almost smiled. "That's what she said too." Then the lights went out. Complete darkness. The emergency generators kicked in seconds later, painting the hallway in blood-red light. But by then, I was already gone, swallowed by the maze of corridors. Outside, the storm had broken. Rain hammered the pavement, washing the city in streaks of silver. I drove until the skyline disappeared behind me, until the sound of thunder drowned out the thoughts clawing at my mind. Claire was alive. Evelyn was captive. And Dalton was no longer just a target. He was the key. Somewhere deep inside the hard drive, I knew there was more. Another file, another secret. Something that would decide how this story ended. And as I crossed the empty highway, lightning tearing open the clouds, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. The reckoning wasn't coming. It was already here. The storm didn't stop for 3 days. It followed me across the countryside like a curse, flooding every road, every field, every thought. It felt as though the whole world wanted to wash itself clean of everything that had happened. Blackridge, the ledger, the lies. But the truth doesn't wash away, it stains deeper the longer you run from it. By the time I reached the coast, the gas gauge was hovering near empty. I left the car on the shoulder and followed the shoreline on foot, the wind cutting through me like glass. The coordinates on Harper's map led here, an old facility built into the cliffs, abandoned decades ago after a landslide, or so the government claimed. It was past midnight when I found the entrance, half buried under rock, sealed by rusted gates, marked only by a single symbol carved into the metal, H. Harlow. Inside, the air was damp and metallic, filled with the echo of dripping water. My flashlight beam caught fragments of a staircase descending into the dark. The deeper I went, the stronger the hum became, a low electrical vibration that seemed to pulse beneath the floor. The tunnel opened into a cavern lit by old generators. Rows of computers lined the walls, their screens flickering weakly. Cables snaked across the ground, connecting to a central pod made of reinforced glass. And inside that pod, motionless, wired to machines, was Evelyn. Her face was pale but alive, chest rising slowly. Electrodes mapped her pulse. She wasn't a prisoner in the usual sense. She was a conduit, connected directly to the network that stored every file from the ledger. The screen surrounding her showed fragments of data, lines of code looping endlessly. At the center of it all, one phrase repeated across every monitor: Project Harlow, active. I stepped forward, my reflection fractured across the glass. Evelyn. Her eyes flickered open at the sound. For a moment, recognition broke through the haze. Her lips moved faintly. "Mason?" I reached for the release panel, but before I could touch it, the lights shifted. White to red. The hum deepened into a roar, and from the far side of the chamber, a door slid open. Dalton stepped through. He looked untouched by the chaos, immaculate even here, in the ruins. Rainwater still glistened on his coat. His voice carried easily over the machines. "You really don't know when to stop." I didn't answer. Words were useless now. He approached the pod and glanced at Evelyn almost tenderly. She volunteered, you know. She believed in what Claire was building. They both did. The words twisted through me. "You're lying." He shook his head. "Not this time. Claire didn't vanish because of me. She chose this. She's been here, Mason, behind all of it. The ledger, the prison, the containment. You weren't the target. You were the fail-safe." He pressed a key on a console and one of the side panels slid open. A new feed appeared on the monitors, a live video. Claire, older, colder, standing in what looked like another control room somewhere within the facility. The same calm precision in her voice as in the old video, but this time, no hesitation. "Mason?" she said, and hearing my name from her mouth again felt like being pulled backward through time. "If you've made it here, then everything worked. I needed someone who could reach the core, someone Dalton couldn't control. You were the only one who fit both profiles." My throat closed. "You used me." "I trusted you," she said. "There's a difference. This place isn't about punishment. It's about protection. The ledger holds every secret that could collapse governments, erase economies. If it's released, the world doesn't heal. It burns. I couldn't let that happen. Neither could Evelyn." I stared at the pod, at the wires coiling from her body into the network. "She's dying." "She's sustaining the firewall," Claire replied. "When her vitals end, so does the containment. You can end this, Mason. You can shut it down, but you'll unleash everything. Every crime, every truth, every sin buried by Black Ridge." Dalton folded his arms, watching silently as the storm raged through the open doorway behind him. The choice hung between us, heavier than any weapon. I looked at Evelyn, her eyes pleading through the glass, a faint shake of her head. Then at the screen where Claire waited, expression unreadable. All the years I'd chased justice, I'd believed the truth was the goal. Now, face to face with it, I realized truth was just another kind of prison. The air trembled as the systems reached overload. Sirens blared. Claire's voice came through again, strained now. "Mason, whatever you decide, do it quickly." I took one last breath and stepped toward the control terminal. My reflection merged with Evelyn's in the glass, two halves of the same broken plan. Then I pressed the override key. Light flooded the room, pure, searing white. The hum became a scream, data spilling across every surface like a storm of language. The screens shattered one by one, and for a second I saw Claire's face dissolve into static. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the cold floor. The pod was empty, the cables were severed, the monitors dead. Through the open hatch above, dawn was breaking, the first sunlight I'd seen without bars or walls in years. Dalton was gone, Claire was gone, Evelyn too. All that remained was the hard drive in my pocket, now inert, its data wiped clean. Outside, the tide was rising, swallowing the rocks below. The world looked untouched, almost peaceful, as though nothing had ever happened. I stood there for a long time, watching the sun climb. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and rain, and for the first time, I felt something close to quiet. Maybe the truth didn't survive, maybe it wasn't supposed to, but I had. And in that survival, there was a kind of reckoning, one no system, no prison, no ghost could ever erase. As I walked back toward the road, the sea roared behind me, relentless and eternal. Somewhere out there, in the ruins of Black Ridge and the whispers of its secrets, I knew Claire's plan still lived. Maybe that was enough. I slipped the empty drive into my coat pocket, the metal warm against my palm, and whispered to no one. This time I'm free. Then I kept walking and didn't look back.